And it's not the only hack. Apparently, it was one of 16 successful major hacks on Australian companies in November alone. Joining me live for more on this is Cyber Intelligence and Public Policy Director at CyberCX, Katherine Mansted. Thanks for your time. So, interesting headline on this, successful attacks. Are they not as successful as what happened on Medibank? What does that actually mean? Do they get data, cash? What do we know about them?
Yeah, so we're talking about 16 major attacks against Australian organisations in November, Tom. These are cyber extortion attacks. So these are the less likely but really high impact type of cyber attacks that Australian organisations face. It's the ransomware attack or the data theft extortion attack like that experienced by Medibank, when the cyber criminals come in, they lock up your systems or they steal your most sensitive data and threaten you, hold you at risk until you pay them a ransom.
And so the other interesting part about this is the multiple groups involved. What does this show, that more and more people see Australia in particular as a honeypot?
Yeah, that's the most remarkable thing actually here. So we had 16 attacks that were publicly claimed by major cyber extortion groups in November, but that activity was spread across 12 organisations. Now, in the past, we've normally seen about 4 or 5 cyber extortion gangs victimising Australia. 12 is actually quite a significant number. What that tells us is a couple of things. The first is that perhaps it's becoming easier for these cyber extortion groups to break into the market. There's a commoditisation of malware and the tools of doing harm online that's occurring. We're also seeing a lot of volatility in Russia and Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that's potentially driving cybercrime, because a lot of our cyber criminals, the big end of town for cybercrime occurs in Russia or former Soviet states. And it's also possibly true, as you suggest, Tom, that when there are more high-profile breaches against Australia, that in some sense might encourage more cyber criminals to try their hand at victimising Australian organisations and ultimately the Australian consumers who sit behind and are serviced by those organisations.
So 2 things to do is to make us much tougher to hack. There's a lot of talk around that in terms of what we do. But what about your view on banning paying these hackers? Because then you theoretically at least remove the honeypot, but nothing's perfect in terms of a ban. But would that help? Have other countries around the world done it and seen a drop-off, for example, in hacks? Is there real-world evidence?
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of countries have considered it, and I think absolutely we should have all options on the policy table as we confront what is potentially an existential threat to Australia's economy, which is the scourge of ransomware. But other countries have considered it. The US, for example, have put up policy proposals and they haven't taken them on because of the fear that if you ban ransom payments, that in some sense you're taking away an option from companies and organisations providing essential services to people who are facing the worst day of their lives. So that's one issue there, but also because, of course, whenever you have policy intervention, sometimes there are unintended consequences. I like to think of the cybercrime ecosystem, which is incredibly persistent. It's incredibly focused on causing harm to make money. I like to think of it as a balloon. If you squeeze that balloon in one spot and you close down one avenue of attack, the air will pop up somewhere else in the balloon and will cause new problems, will cause adaptation in the tradecraft of cyber criminals. So I think we should be having all options on the table, but we need to think about this in terms of a holistic response that brings together more regulation on companies, more awareness of the threat, more intelligence sharing, and more action from government and law enforcement in particular to disrupt cybercrime so that Australia becomes a much less permissive environment to these global cybercrime gangs.
A lot comes down to individuals. I'm going to dob in my wife here because she got sent something recently and she said, I got sent this thing, it had a link, I clicked on it. And I said, what do you mean you clicked on it? And she said, well, it didn't look like a bank bill, but I clicked on it anyway. And she said, I didn't do anything else. And I said, well, that's it, you've been hacked. How true is that? If you just click on the link in a text message and then do nothing else, how likely are you to have something stolen or infiltration in your phone? And what can you do after that?
Firstly, as a shout out to your wife, she wouldn't be the only person. And in fact, it can happen to all of us. We live busy digital lives and the scammers online, they exploit that. They exploit our sense of urgency. They exploit our information overload to try and get us to do things that we shouldn't do. Now, if you click on a dodgy link, it doesn't mean it's the end times. There are things you can do. Really depends on what you do next. If it takes you to a portal that encourages you to input your credentials, for instance, say your banking credentials, well, then you may have passed them on to an attacker. Even still, there are things you can do. Contact your bank, for instance, make sure that your security settings are up to date, alert them to what you've done, and you might be able to walk that back. If you're working at a company, at an enterprise, and you click on a link that's dodgy, give your friendly IT folk a call so that they can assess the damage and see if there's any remediation steps that need to be done. But that's why it's important to realise that this can happen to all of us. It's not actually just the tech illiterate or just those who are having a bad day that click on bad links. All of us do it, and so there should be no shame in coming forward and letting your bank or letting your company know when you have made a pretty easy mistake.
Well, I know she's not watching because she hasn't texted me. The one thing I told her to do was turn her phone on and off, which I was at a talk once with an expert, and they said, doing this once a day, if there's someone somehow lurking in there, it kicks them off, and they'd have to somehow get re-entry to dumb it right down and sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. How true is that?
Look, I think for some, and for the activists and the human rights activists, the high-profile politicians who maybe you've got a nation state on your tail, turning your phone on and off at the end of the day, that can go some way if there's someone lurking in your phone. But that's probably not going to save you if you've handed your credentials over to a cyber criminal. Once they've got those credentials, they potentially are going to use them to log in as you, impersonate you, commit fraud. So, of course, there's a range of different remediation steps that you can take. To me, the most kind of for the everyday person, the most obvious and logical steps that you can take, apart from not clicking on phishing links and not engaging with them, but also have multi-factor authentication activated on your accounts, and particularly most important, email banking. And then if something does happen and the bad guys do get access to a password, you've got that extra layer of defense, a multi-layered approach to defense, so that they can't necessarily then take that next step that causes you harm.
Yeah, I was shocked to check my security and it said, I don't know how many passwords had somehow been indirectly exposed. So that was a good few hours changing passwords, but worth it in the end. Katherine Mansted, great to get the advice for the viewers and my own personal life as well. Thank you.
No worries. Good to be with you, Tom.